Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. This is how a war starts in the 2020s. Not with a declaration, not with an invasion, but with actions that are never officially called war, moves that stay just below the threshold, hard to name, harder to stop. By the time anyone argues over what to call it, the confrontation is already real. For Donald Trump, this kind of conflict fits instinctively. He has never been comfortable with slow pressure or quiet diplomacy. Power in his worldview has to be visible, it has to look decisive, and it has to feel personal. When he looks at Venezuela, he does not see a distant foreign policy problem. He sees a weak adversary, close to home, surrounded by symbols his voters already understand. By the early 2020s, Venezuela had become a familiar villain in American politics, a socialist state in collapse, an economy in ruins, a government accused of corruption, repression, and criminal ties. For Trump, it was an example that required no explanation. You did not need to persuade people that Venezuela was dangerous or illegitimate. Many already believed it. At the same time, something else was happening beneath the surface. The United States was no longer simply pressuring Venezuela through sanctions and speeches. Military assets were moving, naval patrols increased, intelligence activity intensified. None of it was announced as preparation for war, but none of it looked accidental either. This is where future conflict begins to take shape. Not as a single decision, but as a sequence of choices that lower the cost of escalation. Each move is defensible on its own. Each one avoids crossing a formal red line. Together, they change the relationship. For Trump, that ambiguity is not a weakness. It is an advantage. Ambiguity keeps opponents guessing. It keeps allies cautious. And it allows him to project strength without asking permission from Congress, from courts, or from international institutions. At this stage, the question is not yet why Trump would confront Venezuela so aggressively. It is how he could do so without ever calling it a war. And the answer begins with the excuse that makes everything else possible. Because before force can be used, it must first be explained. The excuse arrives in a form Americans already recognize: drugs. For years, Venezuela has appeared in U.S. political rhetoric as part of the global drug trade. That alone is not new. What changes under Trump is how that problem is framed. Drug trafficking is no longer treated primarily as crime. It is redefined as something closer to warfare, and that shift matters more than it appears. In Trump's language, drugs are not just illegal substances. They are weapons. They kill Americans in large numbers. They weaken society. And the people who move them are no longer just criminals exploiting markets, but enemies attacking the country from the outside. Once that framing takes hold, the response does not need to look like policing. It can look like force. For a president who dislikes procedural limits, this distinction is crucial. Crime requires evidence, arrests, and trials. War does not. War allows speed. War allows secrecy. War allows the president to act first and justify later. By talking about drug traffickers as hostile actors rather than suspects, Trump gains room to maneuver. But the logic only works if the threat feels real and immediate. That is where the story begins to strain. The drug devastating the United States is fentanyl, a synthetic opioid killing tens of thousands of Americans every year. And fentanyl does not come from Venezuela. It flows overwhelmingly through Mexico, produced and distributed by networks far removed from the Caribbean. Venezuela's role in the drug trade is narrower. It serves as a transit point for some cocaine shipments, many bound for Europe rather than the United States. Cocaine is dangerous, but it is not the primary driver of the American overdose crisis. If this were truly a war on the drugs killing Americans, Venezuela would not be the main battlefield. That mismatch creates the first crack in the official story. The excuse works rhetorically, but not logically. It explains how force can be justified, but not why it is being aimed here. And once that doubt appears, the viewer is pushed toward a more uncomfortable question. If this confrontation is not really about stopping drugs, then drugs are not the reason. They are the permission. And the real motive lies somewhere else, somewhere more strategic and far more consequential. That motive becomes clearer the moment China enters the picture. By the time Trump is escalating pressure on Venezuela, Beijing is no longer a distant observer in Latin America. It is a deeply embedded economic actor, and nowhere is that more visible than in Venezuela's energy sector. As U.S. sanctions tighten and Western companies pull back, China steps in, buying oil, extending loans, and keeping the Venezuelan state financially alive. From Trump's perspective, this is not an abstract geopolitical concern. It is personal, immediate, and symbolic. China is not supposed to be operating freely in what Americans still instinctively think of as their backyard. A Chinese-backed government sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world, just off the U.S. coastline, looks less like a regional nuisance and more like a strategic failure. Venezuela's oil is the key. Nearly everything the country exports is crude, and China becomes its most important customer. Billions of dollars in Chinese loans are repaid not in cash, but in guaranteed future oil shipments. Over time, Venezuela's production capacity, infrastructure, and debt obligations begin to point east rather than north. Influence follows the oil. For Trump, this creates a problem sanctions alone cannot solve. Economic pressure is supposed to isolate governments and force concessions. In Venezuela's case, it does the opposite. Isolation pushes Caracas deeper into China's orbit. Every restriction imposed by Washington narrows Venezuela's options until Beijing becomes less a partner and more a lifeline. This is where the conflict stops being about Venezuela's behavior and starts being about alignment. A weak socialist state is one thing. A weak socialist state effectively underwritten by America's primary global rival is something else entirely. At that point, pressure is no longer about reform. It is about preventing a permanent shift in the balance of power. For a president who views international politics as a series of zero-sum contests, this is unacceptable. Letting Venezuela drift fully into China's camp would look like retreat. Acting against it, visibly, forcefully, looks like resistance. And this is why drugs alone are never enough to explain what comes next. The real escalation begins when Venezuela is no longer seen just as a failed state, but as a platform, one that China is already using, and one Trump is unwilling to concede without a fight. Once China is part of the equation, the way Trump looks at Venezuela changes. The country is no longer just a problem to manage. It becomes a signal, a test case for how far the United States is willing to let a rival power expand influence in its own hemisphere. Trump does not approach this as a traditional strategist. He does not think in terms of long policy papers or carefully sequenced incentives. He thinks in terms of leverage and pressure. If sanctions are not enough, they are not abandoned. They are supplemented. The question becomes what additional tools can be used without triggering a full-scale war or requiring congressional approval. This is where Venezuela's weakness matters. Its economy is already shattered. Its diplomatic relationships are thin. Its military, while loyal to the regime, is limited in reach. From Trump's perspective, this makes Venezuela a low-risk arena for escalation. The costs of pressure are unlikely to fall on the United States in the short term, while the display of strength is immediate. At the same time, delegitimizing Venezuela's leadership becomes strategically useful. By treating the government not as a normal state but as a criminal enterprise, Trump lowers the political barrier to action. Criminals can be hunted. Criminal networks can be dismantled. And operations against them do not require the same public justification as actions against a recognized government. This framing also personalizes the conflict. It turns a geopolitical rivalry into a contest between individuals, between Trump and a foreign leader portrayed as corrupt, fraudulent, and dangerous. That personalization fits Trump's political instincts. He is most effective when conflicts feel direct and moralized, not abstract or technocratic. As pressure increases, the line between economic warfare and military posture begins to blur. Naval deployments, intelligence operations, and regional shows of force do not announce an invasion, but they communicate intent. They tell allies, rivals, and domestic audiences that Venezuela is no longer being handled quietly. At this stage, the confrontation does not need to be resolved to be effective. It only needs to be visible. And visibility is what transforms Venezuela from a policy problem into a stage, one where Trump can demonstrate resistance to China, dominance in the hemisphere, and personal command over American power, all at once. That visibility serves another purpose. It shifts the conflict away from outcomes and toward posture. By this point, it is clear that pressure alone will not collapse the Venezuelan government. Sanctions have already hollowed out the economy. Diplomatic isolation has already been absorbed. If change were going to come quickly, it would have come by now. For Trump, this does not make escalation pointless. It changes what escalation is for. The confrontation no longer needs to end in regime change to be useful. It only needs to continue. As long as Venezuela remains an open conflict, it can be activated politically whenever needed. This is where Trump's instincts differ sharply from traditional foreign policy thinking. Conventional strategy treats unresolved conflict as failure. Trump treats it as leverage. An ongoing standoff can be cited, intensified, or de-escalated on demand. It creates a constant sense of motion, of action, even when nothing fundamentally changes on the ground. Venezuela is particularly well suited to this role. It is close enough to feel relevant, weak enough to be pressured, and isolated enough that escalation does not immediately pull the United States into a broader war. Each move can be framed as defensive. Each response can be described as necessary. The threshold for too far remains conveniently vague. This posture also reinforces Trump's preferred image of leadership. He is not managing decline or negotiating compromise. He is confronting threats. Even when the threat is strategically ambiguous, the act of confrontation itself becomes the point. Strength is measured by willingness to apply pressure, not by whether pressure achieves a clear result. At this stage, the question of whether escalation will work becomes secondary. What matters is that it looks decisive, sounds uncompromising, and signals dominance. Venezuela does not need to fall. It only needs to remain standing as a visible opponent, and that makes the conflict remarkably durable, not because it is unsolvable, but because it is useful, especially when the focus shifts from foreign adversaries to domestic audiences who are watching closely. Those domestic audiences are not an afterthought. They are central to why Venezuela becomes such a persistent target. In the United States, few foreign policy issues map as cleanly onto domestic politics as Venezuela. The country has become a shorthand in American discourse, a cautionary tale about socialism, economic collapse, and authoritarian rule. For Trump, this symbolism is invaluable. It allows him to turn a complex foreign situation into a simple story his voters already understand. Nowhere does this matter more than in Florida. The state is home to a large Venezuelan exile community, many of whom fled the country's economic and political breakdown. Their opposition to the government in Caracas is intense and personal. Florida is also a decisive swing state. Taking a hard line against Venezuela is not just foreign policy, it is electoral strategy. But the domestic utility goes beyond votes. Framing Venezuela as an active conflict helps Trump argue for extraordinary authority at home. Wartime language expands presidential power. It weakens demands for due process. It justifies aggressive actions that might otherwise be blocked by courts or Congress. Even when those claims are challenged legally, visible military posture gives them weight. What matters here is not whether the United States is formally at war. It is whether the president can plausibly act as if it is. Ambiguity becomes a tool. It allows Trump to operate in the gray zone between peace and war, where oversight is weaker and discretion is greater. This is why the confrontation never needs to be resolved. Ending it would remove its usefulness. A settled relationship would offer fewer opportunities to demonstrate strength, fewer justifications for exceptional measures, and fewer moments to dominate the political narrative. By the time this pattern is clear, the title's question no longer needs to be asked directly. Trump is at war with Venezuela not because a traditional war is being fought, but because sustained confrontation serves his interests, strategic, political, and personal, all at once. The conflict exists because it works, not on the battlefield, but where it matters most to him. Seen from the outside, this confrontation can look incoherent. The drug rationale does not line up with the data. Pressure on Venezuela does not weaken China so much as bind the two closer together. Escalation produces movement, but not resolution. By the standards of traditional strategy, it looks inefficient and unstable. But that judgment assumes the goal is resolution. For Trump, the value of the conflict lies elsewhere. Venezuela functions as a pressure point that can be activated without crossing the formal thresholds that constrain other uses of force. It is close, familiar, and symbolically loaded. Acting against it sends messages in several directions at once, to China, to regional allies, to domestic opponents, and to voters who expect toughness rather than patience. This is why the confrontation never quite becomes a war and never quite fades back into peace. It lives in the space between. That space allows Trump to project authority without asking permission, to personalize foreign policy without committing to outcomes, and to maintain a posture of constant action even when results are uncertain. In this sense, Venezuela is not an objective to be achieved. It is a role to be played, a standing adversary that helps define Trump's image as a leader who confronts rather than manages, who escalates rather than negotiates. The conflict persists because it reinforces that image every time it is referenced, intensified, or revived. By the end, the question of whether this is a real war becomes less important than what the confrontation does. It reshapes legal arguments, political messaging, and strategic signaling, all without the costs of a declared conflict. The ambiguity is not a flaw. It is the mechanism. That is how this kind of war begins, and why it does not need to end. Not with victory or defeat, but with a sustained confrontation that makes itself useful simply by existing.